Can you trust the Gospels? I'm about to offer you 3 straightforward lines of evidence which suggest that the 4 Gospels are actually reliable.
Hey! This is right up my alley. Now, I've had good conversations with Lukas before, so I'm going to try not to be as abrasive as I usually am because he's a good guy. I'm always very interested in any information that can prove me wrong about Christianity. So maybe Lukas is going to convince me that Christianity is historically reliable today. If you want to fuck around and find out if Lukas is going to convince me that Christianity is historically accurate, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Now, on the onset here, obviously, I'm going to disagree with Lukas about the Gospels. They are not historically reliable, and I have many reasons to come to this conclusion. 1. The Gospels are written anonymously, so there's no way for us to know if they're actually reporting history. 2. They were written at a time when any eyewitnesses would have been dying off. 3. The Gospels don't list any kind of citation other than Scripture. 4. The Gospels are all interdependent on one another, and they're supposed to be reporting first-hand eyewitness accounts of the events. That don't make sense. 5. These same first-hand accounts are all contradictory in both small and radically large ways. 6. There are obvious portions of these Gospels that have been lifted from the Old Testament. 7. Many of the events have narrative and theological reasons for happening. 8. Many of the events and people are not historically accurate. And 9. Many of the Gospels have noticeably been tampered with, and that's just with the edits that we know about. And honestly, that's just 9 points that I could think of for the purposes of this video. So, Lukas has a rather large hill to overcome if he's gonna prove to me that Christianity is historically accurate. So, let's see what he's got.
Let's jump into it right away. First, corroboration by non-biblical documents. Besides the Gospels, there are a total of 17 non-biblical sources from the 1st and 2nd century that mention Jesus and corroborate details of his life which are mentioned in the Gospels.
There are no external, independent sources that corroborate the Gospels. The Gospels manufacture their entire narrative regardless of whether or not Jesus existed. And for the sake of this particular video, I'm going to assume that he did. The fact is that there are no external references to anything that happens in the Gospels that don't already just use the Gospels for that information. This is the definition of circular logic.
Such as the fact that he had disciples, that he was a teacher, or that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is pretty impressive if you consider the fact that in order to reconstruct the lives of most figures from the ancient past, historians can usually refer to only a handful or even just one single source.
But we don't have any references that corroborate those statements. Now, there are some New Testament scholars that seem to fabricate sources that independently attest to those ideas. And you know, it's not really all that great if you have to fabricate information in order to make your argument believable. Of course, that's not even what Lukas is talking about. What he's talking about are external sources that corroborate what's already in the Gospels, but I can guarantee you with 100% certainty, whatever person in history he's going to bring up that references information in the Gospels are either already using the Gospels themselves or have heard this information from Christians.
Among the 17 sources are, for example, the Roman historian Tacitus, who is considered the most important author upon whom our knowledge of Roman history is based. In his work The Annals, which has been called the pinnacle of Roman historical writing, he establishes that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Tacitus can't establish this idea because he heard it from 2nd century Christians, most likely through Pliny the Younger. And I say 2nd century Christians because that was when Tacitus was writing, the 2nd century. And I mean, that's only if Tacitus actually wrote the portion that has all the highly Christianized information in it to begin with, which there is a solid case to be made that he did actually write that portion. It's an interpolation. Not only that, but Tacitus is talking about Christus and Christians, not Christ and Christians. In any case, Robert Van Voorst and R.T. France have both concluded that Tacitus is not an independent source about any information concerning Jesus. And they conclude this because there's no way for us to prove that Tacitus is independent of the Gospels.
The 2nd century philosopher Celsus, in his attack against Christianity called True Doctrine, argues that Jesus was a magician and sorcerer, thus ascribing supernatural acts to him.
2nd century Celsus was responding to Christian theology. By the time Celsus was writing, the Christian community had all 4 Gospels at their fingertips, as well as the heretical texts. How in the world can Celsus verify these statements about Jesus? He's literally just regurgitating what 2nd century Christians were already saying about Jesus because they were informed by the Gospels. Nobody had any kind of way of independently verifying the Gospels account at this time, let alone did Celsus even care about the historical veracity of the information that Christians were spouting. He was just responding to the Gospel tradition that had already been established. Again, this is circular reasoning.
So all in all, there are a total of about 60 facts about the life of Jesus that can be known from outside the New Testament. And what's fascinating is that a wide range of very specific details pertaining to political procedures or social norms, for example, which the Gospels mention only in passing, get corroborated by non-biblical sources. These tiny little details make for a very compelling cumulative case for the historical reliability of the biblical account, since it's very unlikely that anyone would know about them unless they were actually present at the events which they describe.
Well, all 60 of these facts, which I don't know which facts he's talking about because he's not really being all that specific here about the facts, but my guess is that all 60 facts are already contained in the Gospels, and any external source that would be referencing these 60 facts are going to be using the Gospels in order to know these facts. I don't know how much more blatantly circular you can be. Furthermore, Mark's Gospel definitely fucks up the procedures and norms of the Jewish people. So much so that Matthew felt compelled to come back and fix all of Mark's mistakes. This is because Mark was not a Jew and was not from this area of the world. We're going to be getting into this a little bit more here in just a few minutes. But even so, let's assume that at least some of these facts were just small incidental details. How does getting a few small incidental details that were commonly known at the time, how does that prove that Jesus did anything that the Gospels report? Regardless of the fact that Mark doesn't know his ass from a hole in the ground, just because the other Gospel writers get a few basic details correct doesn't mean that the rest of their Gospel story is accurate. This same logic can be used to prove any other fictional story that's set in the real world. At that point, can you really use this method to determine fact from fiction? I don't think so.
Now, let's talk about archaeological discoveries. John's Gospel describes Jesus healing a man whom he met at the pool of Bethesda, located in the vicinities of Jerusalem. John specifically mentions that the pool was surrounded by 5 porticos. For a long time, there was no archaeological evidence of such a pool outside of Jerusalem, which was part of the reason why the reliability of John's Gospel was questioned.
This is the first time I've ever heard this argument being used to doubt the reliability of John's Gospel. Of course, I'm only looking at the most recent scholarship because that's going to be the best scholarship that we have. So maybe he's referring to some kind of like old argument against the reliability of John's Gospel. But I can assure you we have much better reasons to doubt the reliability of John's Gospel now. Like the fact that John's Gospel was most likely written in the 2nd century, so there's no way that he could have had access to any eyewitness accounts. John's Gospel was also written as a rebuttal and redaction of the previous Gospels. And also the fact that the Gospel itself lies to us blatantly about where this information comes from doesn't instill a lot of trust. John's Gospel also has a lot of stories that are just inserted into the narrative. Like that time that Jesus saves Mary Magdalene from that crowd of uptight Jewish people. That wasn't original to the Gospel of John. It was inserted later into his narrative by somebody that was looking to push an agenda. There's nothing in John's Gospel that screams historically reliable, and these porticos are the least of John's worries.
However, archaeologists have since dug out the pool and its 5 porticos, which means that John got it right. For a long time, skeptics also cast a doubt on the historicity of the Passion narrative by pointing out that there isn't any evidence evidence that Romans ever used nails for crucifixion. It was thought that people were tied to the cross with ropes instead.
Again, this is the first time I've heard this particular argument against the crucifixion. Now, I think that ropes were probably used in order to keep the person up on the cross, but nails were also definitely used. But it's also important to understand that crucifixion has a rather complex history. Sometimes, crucifixion victims weren't nailed to anything. You see, crucifixion is a type of suspension punishment or execution device. And the earliest forms of it were just pikes where people were just stuck onto it like a kebab. Other times, crucifixion was used in order to display dead bodies. This is actually a form that's found in the Old Testament itself. In the Old Testament, if you broke certain laws, you would be stoned to death and then your body would be hung out on display. Now, this isn't Roman crucifixion because that's a very specific type, but it does meet the qualifications for being a type of crucifixion. Whether nails were used or not in Roman crucifixion is kind of inconsequential, so I wouldn't be convinced by that particular argument. An argument that I am convinced by as far as doubting the crucifixion of Jesus is the fact that we don't have any Roman records whatsoever of his crucifixion. If his crucifixion was as big a deal as the Gospels make it out to be, which is ultimately what Lukas is arguing for here, then we definitely would have some kind of Roman information on this crucifixion. But we don't, and that is convincing to me. When you combine this with the fact that the Old Testament was being reinterpreted in order to say that this Messiah figure that's promised by the Old Testament was to be executed, he was to be shamed, he was to be beaten and killed in order to absolve sins, it makes it seem like the crucifixion was just something that was theologically necessary, and so they made up a narrative about it. And that particular argument convinces me that the crucifixion most likely never happened. What I am convinced by, as far as John's gospel is concerned, is the fact that he has to use the previous gospels in order to generate his own eyewitness account, which is just like Matthew and Luke's gospel.
What's more, the account of Jesus' burial in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea was also considered to be non-factual, since it was thought that Romans consistently left their crucifixion victims hanging on the cross to be picked apart by birds. However, in the late 1960s, a stone ossuary from the 1st century was found containing the bones of a crucifixion victim with an 11-centimeter spike still piercing his heel bones. This discovery showed not only that nails were at least sometimes used in crucifixion, but also that some victims were granted a proper burial.
Some victims could have been given proper burials, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus was definitely given a proper burial. Most likely, Jesus' body would have been left on display for a time and then tossed in a mass grave, because that is the most likely conclusion to that scenario, if it even happened. But really, that's just a minor inconsistency with the tomb idea. First of all, we don't have any record of Joseph of Arimathea outside of the Gospels. He sounds like a completely invented character for narrative purposes. First, he only appears when he's needed, like fucking Batman. And then, again, like Batman, he just disappears into the ether without being heard of again. This is actually counter to how histories handle their historical figures. Also, his name kind of seems fabricated as well. First off, you've got Joseph, one of the most common names in that area for a Jew to have at the time. And then you have Arimathea, which seems to be a combination of words that ends up equating to best disciple town. So, Joseph of Arimathea becomes Joseph of Best Disciple Town. And Joseph was supposed to be some kind of secret disciple of Jesus. So that would dissuade me from this whole idea that Joseph of Arimathea gave his tomb over for Jesus' body to be buried in. Not this whole argument about the nails. And I totally think that you can assume that Jesus was definitely crucified and still not believe in the empty tomb or that there was a tomb at all. Our earliest accounts from Paul don't even mention a tomb. Paul just says his ass was buried. Didn't really say where or how.
The third argument in favor of the reliability of the gospel accounts is the fact that they accurately describe the geography of 1st century Palestine, mentioning a total of 26 different towns, both significant and insignificant ones. Besides that, they also talk about 13 geographical regions and a whole range of topographical features like mountains, bodies of water, or even travel routes. And it's remarkable that every single geographical geographical detail they mention is correct.
Now, what he's saying here is correct for later Gospels, but it's definitely bullshit for Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel gets so many things incorrect. Specifically, he gets geographical locations incorrect. Now, you would think if somebody was an eyewitness that followed these guys around, that knew disciples of Jesus or whatever, you would think that they would know the basic geography of the land that they're walking around in, right? Not this fuck. Werner Kummel had this to say in his introduction to the New Testament. The author obviously has no personal knowledge of Palestinian geography, as the numerous geographical errors show. He does not know the account of the death of the Baptist, contradicts Palestinian customs. Could a Jewish Christian from Jerusalem miss the fact that 635 and 8:1 are two variants of the same feeding story? Yeah, if you didn't know, in Mark's Gospel, there's actually two feeding of the multitudes. But it's very obvious that they're the exact same story. It's just that Mark didn't know that they were the same story, so he included them both. And he has this contrived way of connecting the two. But you can obviously tell that these are two of the same stories, and he really struggled to make them fit. As far as geographical locations being incorrect goes, he has Jesus going both north and south at the exact same time in Mark 7:31. In that verse, Jesus leaves from Tyre, going north to Sidon, and then has him flip a bitch and go all the way back down to the Sea of Galilee near the Decapolis. Why would he do this? There's no reason for him to do this. If you know the area and you want to go to the Sea of Galilee, and that's where you were wanting to go, that's your end destination, why would you go the exact fucking opposite direction? You wouldn't. And this is the gospel that all other gospels use in order to generate their narratives. But Mark not only does this once, but he does it twice. Mark 11:1 has Jesus going from Jericho to Jerusalem via Bethphage, then Bethany. I know that nobody really knows like the geography at this time where these cities are located, but this is a really dumb fucking route to go. Because you see, as Jesus is going from Jericho to Bethphage, he would then have to go the complete opposite direction of Jerusalem to go to Bethany, and then he'd have to retrace his steps, he'd have to flip a bitch over there at Bethany, and then go all the way to Jerusalem. Again, why the fuck would you do that? Who's navigating this sumbitch? Apple Maps? This is not the reliable geographic locations that we've been told about by Lukas here. Now, Matthew does come in and correct Mark's geographical mistakes, but that shouldn't detract from the fact that the earliest gospel, the earliest supposed eyewitness account of Jesus is completely wrong about geographic locations. But ultimately here, Lukas is clinging to a fallacy of composition. He's taking the fact that these gospels get some city names and people correct, and he's applying that to the rest of the gospel narrative. That is a fallacy, because just because they get people names correct, or they get city names correct, it doesn't mean that the rest of the narrative is also correct.
Now, imagine you were going to fabricate the story of a wandering preacher in a country you've never visited, like let's say Uzbekistan, and you didn't have the internet available. Would you be able to name, let alone describe, more than one town? Would you also be able to describe the various regions of the country, its lakes or topography? Most probably not.
Well, just because the internet doesn't exist in his hypothetical example here doesn't mean that I don't have ways of looking up information about an area of the world. Libraries do exist, and I'm sure that there are people that know about Uzbekistan or have lived in Uzbekistan. Also, if I were about to be writing about a religion from a specific area and I were going to be including geographic information, I would think that I would at least know the cities and everything that were there. Mark's author seems to have been doing the bare minimum research for the geographic information of Palestine, but I also admit that maybe he was limited in the amount of information he could get his hands on. It's not like they have the same access to information as we do now. He could have just known city names and not known their relative positions. There are a lot of explanations that are more plausible than gospel reliability, especially when you consider all the other background information we have about the Gospels.
Thus, the fact that the four gospel writers were able to do exactly that gives us good reasons to believe that their accounts are grounded in actual eyewitness testimony of people who followed Jesus as he was preaching in 1st century Palestine.
Well, like I said before, it logically doesn't follow that if some account just gets general names of people and cities correct, that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the account is reliable. But there are many more problems that arise if you assume that these are eyewitness accounts. Like, why would these eyewitnesses need to copy verbatim from other eyewitnesses? If you're an eyewitness, you don't need to copy verbatim from other people. Also, none of the Gospels name either their authors or their sources. Now, before you shit a brick and say that most biographies at this time were anonymous, we know that that's not true. The general practice at the time was to indicate who authored it, even if you were lying about who authored it. If their works are really grounded in eyewitness accounts and they were trying to write a history of these accounts, then you would see an extensive discussion on sources and why these people would have provided the best eyewitness accounts. That's what we find in Arrian's biography on Alexander the Great, an extensive section discussing his sources and why he used those sources. He also discusses how he mitigates contradictions, and guess what we don't find in the Gospels? Any kind of mitigation of contradictions. We only have references to Scripture, and everybody already knew that that was the best place to get your information about God. So no, these Gospels were not informed by eyewitness accounts, at least not as far as we can tell. What were these Gospels based on? A reinterpretation of the Old Testament. This reinterpretation would have been to sort of glean information about the Messiah, what he was supposed to do.
These three arguments obviously don't establish the historicity of every single detail mentioned in the Gospels. But that shouldn't bother us, since corroboration of every single detail is a rather unreasonable standard that no ancient document is required to meet in order for it to be considered reliable.
While I agree that the corroboration of every single detail in these Gospel accounts is unreasonable, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to corroborate major pieces of the narrative, and only a few of them at that. I feel like Lukas is really blowing this out of proportion and is creating a straw man in the process. Suggesting that we expect every single detail of the gospel narratives to be corroborated is a far cry from just expecting some kind of corroboration of Jesus's crucifixion, his ministry, his death and burial. That's all that we're looking for. What makes the Gospels unreliable is a complete absence of source citation or any historically accurate information. The Gospels' interdependence upon one another, as well as their dependence on the Jewish scriptures, is another facet of this that makes the Gospels unreliable. Because what that does is it makes them works of theology, not history.
But on top of that, it's not only that the Gospels can confidently be considered reliable, but that Luke's work in particular, that is, both the Gospel that bears his name and the book of Acts, has actually served secular historians to verify important facts about the 1st century Mediterranean world. In the book of Acts alone, there are over 80 pieces of data pertaining to geography, politics, technology, and transportation described with perfect accuracy.
Oh, really? What pieces of data are we referencing here? Is it data that was commonly referenced or known, like people and city names? The most that Lukas has given us is these inconsequential columns that would have been general knowledge at the time. So are these items general knowledge that was gathered from the other Gospels, or were they actual eyewitness details? Now, we simply can't know if any of this information was actual eyewitness details, because we have no source information about where the Gospels got their data from. And everything that we can tie to either the Old Testament or to the previous Gospels would not be eyewitness information. But even if Luke got any of this information independently correct, does that mean anything for the rest of Jesus' narrative? Luke gets Pilate correct because the first gospel says that he crucified Jesus. If he switched it up at the time when he was writing, people wouldn't have believed his account. Does it mean anything for Jesus' narrative if the author of Luke Acts name drops Pilate. It really doesn't.
And so it's not only that Luke's work is considered reliable, but itself serves as a reference to help reliably reconstruct history. That's why he has been called a historian of the first rank, and it's been said that this author should be placed among the very greatest of historians. Note that Luke introduces his gospel by saying that it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account of Jesus' life. In other words, his goal was to record things as they actually happened, and even contemporary historians are telling us that we have good reasons to take him seriously.
First of all, the person that wrote these quotes was William Ramsay in 1915. The reason why Lukas has to pull from such an old source is because the most recent scholarship definitely proves these ideas wrong. In fact, if you compare Luke's work to the works of actual ancient historians, you'll notice a stark difference between the two. Here's a quick summary of why Luke's Gospel is not a historical biography. Matthew Ferguson lays out an extensive list of the reasons why the Gospels, especially Luke, deviate from actual historical accounts. Reasons like the lack of internally analyzing and addressing the contradictions in the traditions, the presence of the author in the work, the education level of the target audience, genre differences, authorial speculation, a lesser degree of authorial license, interdependence between the Gospels, miracles are central to the story instead of at the fringe, and important events and people just immediately disappear from the narrative. All of these reasons lead us to conclude that Luke is writing theology and not history. So the author of Luke is not a good historian because he isn't a historian. He's a theologian. A random quote from over a century ago is not going to change this fact. My suggestion is to use the most recent scholarship on this kind of information because that's going to give you the most accurate information.
Even so, if the skeptic wants to insist that Luke, as well as Matthew, Mark, and John made up their stories about Jesus, he or she also needs to offer an actual motive or reason why they would do.
We do not have the burden of proof here. We don't have to come up with a counter hypothesis to realize that your argument is faulty. We can weigh the evidence against your argument even if we have no idea how the Gospels were written. It would be like saying that God created the universe, and if you disagree with me, you have to come up with an alternative hypothesis that makes sense of all of this other information in order for you to defeat my argument. We simply don't have to do that. If your evidence doesn't prove your conclusion, then we don't have to have an alternative explanation. But since you ask, I do have a hypothesis. Early Christianity was a mystery cult, like a lot of other mystery cults at the time. One aspect of mystery cults is that they had front-facing stories that were told to the uninitiated or unbaptized. Once you become part of the cult, you are told these secret teachings. A good example of this is the Isis and Osiris cult as indicated by Plutarch in his Moralia. You see, they had front-facing stories about Isis and Osiris that placed them as real people on this earth. But once you are in the cult, you are told these secret teachings, which actually place Isis and Osiris in the celestial realm, and they were never on earth. Now, if we shift over to Christianity, Paul is talking to baptized Christians in his letters, and so he has no need to reference these public-facing stories. The gospel story is eventually written down by whoever wrote Mark as a missionary guidebook on how to preach to the uninitiated or the unbaptized. Later Christians were then unsatisfied with this first gospel, so they decided to take it upon themselves to rewrite his gospel as well as any other gospels that had been previously written. This was all done to reflect the quote-unquote true stories of Christianity. So if you want an alternative hypothesis, there you go!
This is a thorny one when you consider that anyone in the first century who claimed that Jesus of Nazareth was not only the crucified Messiah but nothing short of God in the flesh was likely to suffer seriously, to be persecuted or even fed to the lions in Rome. With this in mind, why would anyone make up a story in which these claims take central stage?
This is a bit anachronistic. The persecution of Christians, while always present as indicated by Paul, was never seen to have been done to people that started the cult in the first place. There's also this idea built into the religion that persecution was expected. Even in the Old Testament are the Jews constantly persecuted by various people. So really this was not unexpected. And just like the persecution of the Jews didn't stop the Jewish religion, the persecution of Christians would not have stopped the belief in Christianity. So this has literally no bearing on whether or not the Christians would have written down shit that they already believed in.
By the way, the willingness of people like Matthew and John to suffer for what they claimed about Jesus is not only a powerful argument for the historical reliability of the Gospels, but it also makes for a very powerful case in support of the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, first the disciples are invented by the Gospels. They are literally non-existent in history until the Gospels mention them. Now, before you shit a brick and you talk about how Paul mentions Peter and James, I just want to let you know that Paul never references those guys as being disciples. He only mentions them as being apostles. Also, another thing to consider in light of this section is that John is neither the author nor the source for the Gospel of John. In fact, scholars have identified Lazarus as being the most likely source for this fourth gospel. And the problem with that is that Lazarus is a completely fabricated individual. John's gospel fabricates this individual as a rebuttal to Luke's Lazarus. So these people that were eventually being persecuted for being Christians were not the ones that were eyewitnesses or were even the first Christians that invented the cult. But even if they were the original Christians that were being persecuted, that doesn't mean that whatever they believed in just because they were being persecuted is true. But let's say that they were the original Christians that developed the cult. Just because they were being persecuted doesn't mean that whatever they believed in was true. People are persecuted for believing in false things all the time, and yet they maintain their belief in false things. So all in all, I don't find that Lukas's video had a lot of good arguments in it. I mean, he provides 3 in there, but none of the 3 seem to really stand up to scrutiny. First, Lukas thinks that there are external biblical sources that corroborate what the Gospels are saying, but that ends up being a circular logic. First, Lukas thinks that there are external non-biblical sources that corroborate what the Gospels say, but that just ends up being a circular argument. Then, he seems to think that there are archaeological finds that definitely suggest that the Gospels are reliable, but all the archaeological stuff that you could definitely point to, like the Pilate Stone or the porticos that he mentioned in John's Gospel, are all incidental facts that don't prove anything about the narrative presented by the Gospel stories. And then finally, the third argument is about geography, which doesn't make a lot of sense considering the very first Gospel that was written got the geography completely wrong, and it was only later corrected by people that actually lived in the area. But they still had to directly But still, they had to verbatim use a lot of Mark's stuff in order to present their eyewitness testimony. So all in all, I don't find any of these arguments to be all that persuasive. I'm sorry, Lukas, you did not convince me of the historical reliability of the Gospels. I guess I will have to keep looking. Thanks for trying. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for Lukas's video today. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about Lukas's arguments here. Do you think that the Gospels are reliable, or do you think that they're not? Let me know in the comments down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe? Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.